You know what? Let's have fun with this one. Abort all children. Alright guys, so in today's video we're going to be providing a bit of an antinatalist argument. It's not one that I personally subscribe to, but it is one that I think is an interesting thought experiment. I'm going to ask you 3 questions, and they're going to all be from the Christian perspective. But before we get into those 3 questions, let's get into 3 pieces of fan art. So first of all, we have Florence, which is based off of this thing from Bumblebee. And it seems to be Dave mostly Florence fan art because we have another Florence by Bumblebee as well. And then finally we have another Eldritch Florence by Grimm. And speaking of grim things, let's go ahead and get into the topic of today's video. The first question I have, if you were a Christian or are a Christian now, have you ever or did you ever believe in something called the Age of Accountability? The Age of Accountability is basically a loose age where humans are suddenly accountable for their actions or accountable for what Christians would say are the wages of sin. Within Christian theology, there's a concept called original sin. Basically, the idea that when Adam and Eve committed their first sins, we all are responsible for the sins of Adam and Eve. The wages of sin are death, and in most Christian theology, that would translate to going to hell, whatever their particular version of hell is. For some Christians, it's a literal lake of fire. For others, it's eternal conscious torment in whatever form that may happen to be. Some Christians believe in the Dante's Inferno version of hell, where there are multiple levels of it, and some are hot, some are cold, but none are quite pleasant. And then there are some versions of hell that are just considered separations from God, but the end result of that separation from God is eternal conscious torture, so I'd argue that it's a distinction without a difference. In either way, hell is never considered to be a pleasant thing to go to in Christian theology, and it is also generally considered to be a permanent thing, a place you go to stay forever. There is no way around it. So even if you're a Christian who believes in something like purgatory or limbo, hell is the permanent thing. It's the thing you definitely don't want to go to. I've only met maybe 1 or 2 Christians in my life that believe that anybody gets a second chance after being in hell. So back to the Age of Accountability. There are multiple Christians who believe in something called the Age of Accountability, even though there is not necessarily scriptural references they can pull on to say that there actually is one. Now, the most they can do is say that, well, God is an all-good God and he wouldn't send infants to hell, therefore the Age of Accountability must be a thing, at least in some form or fashion, though it's impossible to find an arbitrary age that you can actually pin this down to. So the first question is, do you believe in an all-good God, if you happen to be a Christian? If you do, then you can't really believe that he sends innocent children to hell, especially not children who are still in the womb and have not been born yet. Elsewise, you have a God that has basically punished somebody for doing no wrong, simply punishing them for the sins of the father. If you are a type of Christian who wants to argue that someone who's functionally innocent deserves to burn in eternal conscious torture, then I guess we can hash that out in the comment section below. But most people would not believe that an all-good God would engage in such a barbaric practice as this, so we are left with, yes, there must be some kind of Age of Accountability at some point in Christian theology if you are to hold to the idea of an all-good God, and this is going to be important going forward. The second question is, should a Christian do everything in their power to save someone from hell? Now, I'm not asking, is it a Christian's responsibility to save people from hell? They would argue that it's Jesus' responsibility. My question is, should every Christian, in the spirit of being fishers of men, try to save as many people from hell and direct them towards heaven as humanly possible? Basically, should they try to make sure that there is a net total of souls going into heaven as opposed to hell by the time they exit this earth and ultimately go to their own version of the afterlife? Most Christians would agree that it should be a moral duty to try to save souls from hell. They won't say that this is a requirement usually, because many will appeal to the doctrine that faith without works is dead, but faith is ultimately what determines whether or not you get into heaven, but they will at least agree that yes, they should be trying to spread the gospel to save souls. There might be a more efficient way to do this, though. We'll get into that. So, we've got, yes, God does at least have some form of Age of Accountability within his moral scope, because otherwise he would send, innocent children to hell. And we have, yes, a Christian should make sure that as many souls get to heaven and have no chance of getting to hell as possible. Now we get to the third and final question, which is, Are Christians supposed to make sure that there is less sin in the world? Worded another way, should a Christian do everything in their power to make certain that there is less sin in the world when they leave than when they entered it? Most Christians would answer yes, if only in the most benign of senses, where they should not be encouraging people to sin whatever they happen to believe is a sin. They would argue that sin is bad in God's eyes, and the less sin there is in the world, the better, because sin is that which God cannot abide. So in total, the questions stack up as, is there an age of accountability, at least in some sense? Yes, if you want to agree that there is an all-good God. Should Christians try to save as many souls from hell and get them to heaven as possible? Yes. And should Christians try to minimize the amount of sin in the world? Yes. So then, if I could maybe put on the table a modest proposal based off of this criteria: abort all children. Now you may be wondering, is that a bit extreme? Well, let's go ahead and look at the evidence. If you consider the fact that we've already agreed that God will make sure that an aborted fetus, an infant, whatever personhood you want to assign to it, will be going to heaven and not hell, then if you make sure that every child who's potentially born will be born into heaven instead of born into a world of sin and potentially be led astray by Satan to then eventually go to hell, then you agree that you've got two options. You can either abort them and make sure they get to heaven immediately, or you can gamble with their soul and see if they choose the right path in their own life. If there's one thing Cuphead has taught me, it's that you shouldn't be gambling with souls. So you've agreed that your God is all good. You agree that if you make sure that every child who's ever potentially born is aborted, they get to heaven. What about the sin part? Because you're technically engaging in the sin of killing children. But here's the thing. When I worded my statements before, I said net amount. Keep that in mind. Think of the one sin of aborting the child, and now think of every potential sin that that person could engage in when they are born into the world of sin. I think you'll find that mathematically it works out that your one sin is in fact less sin than all of the sins they would potentially commit in their lifetime. You are literally delivering spotless souls to God. You are preventing souls from engaging in sin. Now, some objections you may have. Is that part of God's plan? Is God's plan something that includes the abortion of practically every human child so that they have a one-way trip to heaven guaranteed? To which my answer would be, wait, hold on. Do you know what God's plan is? Can you articulate it bit by bit? Can you tell me every single instance of what God's plan is? Because when you try to articulate what God's plan is, eventually you will come to the conclusion that God works in mysterious ways, and nobody knows what the actual plan is, because his actual plan for the world has not been fully articulated in your Bible. But you might still be hung up on the murder thing, and if that's the case, then that's perfectly fine. Might I provide you with another example of why that's not an area to be hung up on here? Does God provide exception for certain sins in instances of wartime or holy wars? Yes, he's done so for the Israelites on several occasions. So, I would argue, is there any war more holy than the war for one soul? And I'm sure there's going to be at least one conservative Christian in my audience who freaks out about this and goes, no, this isn't a holy war, and then immediately will post on Facebook afterwards that we're engaged in some spiritual battle against principalities, powers, and everything else their Bible says they're in a spiritual war of. But it actually gets worse than that. It's not just abortion. You see, if you believe in an arbitrary age of accountability, for instance, everyone before the age of 12, then you can perform a late-term abortion, and it is technically saving a soul from sin. I think that that would be an incredibly barbaric and horrendous thing to do. I don't think you should take the life of any child, but it is in line with the argumentation, and it's honestly kind of sickening. Now, you might say that none of this is logically consistent and all of this is malarkey, and I would agree with you, because we accepted a false premise from the beginning, an all-good God. If you believe in an all-good God, then these are functionally the end results of that belief. If you believe in a God that is at least capable of evil, and in fact does send infants to hell, then yeah, no, it's probably a good idea not to start aborting all of the infants, because then you're basically throwing them all into a burning lake of fire, or, as I said before, whatever version of hell you happen to have believed in at one point in time or currently. All of this madness that we've engaged in here for the past 8 minutes has been wholly and totally predicated on the premise of an all-good God. If you give up that premise, then we don't have an issue. There are other ways of dealing with the all-good God problem, like the Euthyphro dilemma, or talking about the logical inconsistencies of particular omni traits, but I find this one might hit a little closer to home. The idea that an all-good God would mean that the most efficient plan to save souls from hell is literal genocide. Now, you may have one more argument against this, which is that because you have an all-good God, he wouldn't possibly advocate for the murder of children, because that wouldn't be a good thing. At which point, we are left with a God that is more comfortable with gambling with people's souls and the potentiality that they will engage in internal conscious torture than simply giving them a one-way ticket while they're innocent. And I'd say that again puts him in the category of not an all-good God. Now, from what I understand, there is also a concept of age of accountability within the structure of Islam as well, so you can apply most of these arguments there too and come to the same conclusions. They'll just be conclusions laden with a little more nuclear fruit than you're used to, and if you don't get that reference, link in the description to the Islamic view of hell. Long story short, Zakum fruit is basically an edible bomb. But in conclusion, if you thought that all of this was malarkey, then chances are it's because we began with that flawed premise of an all-good God. If you're willing to give up that premise, then none of the following ones continue, because that's basically how syllogisms work. If you instead accept the premises and just don't like the conclusion, then I'm sorry that you don't like being stuck in your holy war. Go ahead and get your vacuum tubes and pills ready. But as per everything on YouTube, this video is only half of the experience. The other half is in the comment section below, so if you have any agreements, disagreements, criticisms, or you just want to blabber on about what's been going on in your life that's great, then let me know in the comment section below. Let's get the conversation going there. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and share it with your friends. If you have someone who is a hardline conservative Christian, especially if they're against abortion, maybe send this video their way. It might end up having some pretty fun end results. Please remember to subscribe, hit the bell notification icon, even though that's only semi-functional, and remember to check the links down below for Twitch affiliates and all that other fun stuff. And since we are at the end of the video, these are my lovely patrons. The $20 and up patrons are the ones that get these slides here, but all patrons get shown in the credits. These are the people that allow me to afford chicken tenders, so if you like chicken tenders and having the ability to make sure that other people can afford chicken tenders, then why not consider supporting me on Patreon? You get access to a special patrons-only voice chat and text chat in my Discord. You get access to patron-only videos, generally behind-the-scenes stuff, where I talk about future content, and you get access to patron-only hangouts that happen once a month. That's a new thing that I recently started doing. I might also try doing patron live streams at some point, but I'm not 100% certain on that. We'll see. You also get access to videos as soon as they're produced, as opposed to when they come out. So, for instance, this episode is recorded on a Thursday, and it's not going out till Monday, so they get it a whole, 5 days early? That's a bit of a jump. If that's a thing that you enjoy and like and want, then why not consider supporting me on Patreon? That is the best way to keep this channel going and helping me make just inane arguments like the ones in this video. Anyway, guys, remember to do all the YouTube engagement stuff, and thank you for watching the video. It really means a lot to me. I'm going to go play video games and drink diet soda and maybe swim in a lake and hopefully not get bad allergies. Anyway, guys, as always, insert end of video tagline here.